The war ended 4 years ago. The surrender signal is still broadcasting, and that's the problem. Dr. Mayokonkolin pulled the waveform up for the 11th time that shift, laid it over the archived copy from first contact with the ceasefire, and watched the two lines sit on top of each other like they'd been born from the same breath. Identical. Down to the noise floor. Down to a hairline static burst at the 4-minute mark that should have degraded, faded, drifted, anything, across 1,400 days of repetition. It hadn't. 6 hours from now, the Skarn surrender broadcast would loop for the 10,000th time, and somewhere in the last cycle, buried in 3 seconds of static that the analysis AI had long since stopped flagging as anything but artifact, something had changed. May didn't know what yet. She knew it meant the signal wasn't a recording anymore, or it never had been. Kestrel 9 hung in high orbit over Threll's grave, a world the size of Mars with the temperature of a meat locker and the geology of a corpse. For years ago, it had been the operational heart of the Skarn Dominion's western front. Now it was a graveyard with good acoustics, and Kestrel 9's job was to listen to it. The relay station was small, 40 crew, 3 decks, a hull that groaned at a register May had stopped noticing around month 2, and its single purpose, since the armistice, had been to keep an ear on the surrender broadcast in case the Skarn ever said something new. They never had. Until possibly 6 hours ago. "You're doing the thing," said Sefu Adeyemi Park, dropping into the chair beside her with 2 mugs of something that had been coffee in a previous life. He was comms, technically, which on a 40-person station meant he was also morale, also unofficial therapist, also the man who'd once spent 4 days building a betting pool on whether the station cat would have her kittens in the server room. She had. He'd won 11 credits and immediate, lasting infamy. "What thing?" May said, not looking up. "The thing where you go very quiet, and your shoulders climb up around your ears like you're trying to become a turtle. Last time you did that we found out the listening array had been recording a pulsar for 2 years, and nobody noticed, because it sounded like the building settling. This isn't a pulsar." "Okay." He set a mug down by her elbow. "What is it?" May finally looked up. The surrender broadcast has a static burst at the 4-minute mark. Every loop, exact same burst, exact same waveform for 1,400 days. That's the kind of thing that happens when a recording's corrupted in a specific spot and just keeps playing the corruption forever. Right. That's what Command told everyone 4 years ago. Corrupted loop, dying transmitter. Leave it running in case it's a beacon. It's not corruption. She pulled up 2 windows side by side. Cycle 9847 and Cycle 9848. The burst isolated and stretched. Corruption doesn't evolve. Look at the harmonic underneath the static. Cycle to cycle, it's the same fundamental frequency, same amplitude, but the phase is shifting. A fraction of a degree each time. Consistently. In one direction. Sefu leaned in, squinting at numbers that meant nothing to him and everything to her. "Okay, I'll bite. What does a slowly shifting phase mean?" "On its own. Could be thermal drift in a dying transmitter, sure. Components cool, frequencies creep, that's normal decay." She zoomed further. "Except I checked the drift rate against the orbital mechanics of Threll's Grave's third moon, where the original transmitter was located, where the original transmitter isn't anymore, because we glassed that moon in the last week of the war." The room got very quiet. Even the hull noise seemed to hold its breath. "The phase shift," May said slowly, "matches the rotational period of a different structure. One that's still intact. One we never identified, because it wasn't broadcasting 4 years ago." So the signal moved. The signal moved. May sat back. 4 years ago, something was transmitting a surrender message on a dying relay on a moon we destroyed. At some point, I don't know when, the phase data doesn't give me an exact date, just a slope. The transmission source changed location to something that's still active, still powered, still, she swallowed, still broadcasting. Meaning someone's still home. Meaning someone's still transmitting. May corrected, because that was the careful distinction, the one that mattered, the one her training had hammered into her until it was reflex. Could be automated. Could be a relic system nobody's shut off. Could be somebody's been sitting in the dark for 4 years, playing the same recording on a loop, waiting for someone to notice it moved. May didn't answer that. She didn't have to. The static burst pulsed on her screen, patient, regular, unchanged, except for the one thing about it that had been changing, invisibly, the entire time, while 40 people slept 12 meters away, and an AI watched a waveform and saw nothing because it had been told, for years ago, that there was nothing left to see. "I need to take this to Thatcher," she said. "It's 0300. I need to take this to Thatcher now." Colonel Reyes Thatcher had the particular calm of a man who had survived 3 campaigns by never being surprised, which May suspected was less a personality trait than a coping mechanism that had calcified into one. He listened to her for 4 minutes without interrupting, which she'd learned was either a very good sign or a very bad one, and then he said, "Run it again, independently. I want Voss on it too, different methodology, and I want to confirm before this goes anywhere near a priority channel." "Sir, the loop completes in." "I know when the loop completes, Doctor. I read the same logs you do." He rubbed his eyes. He'd been awake for this entire conversation in a robe that had clearly been grabbed off a hook in the dark, and somehow still managed to look more put together than May felt. "Here is the situation. If you're right, we have a 4-year-old transmission anomaly. That means something on a world we depopulated is still broadcasting a surrender we already accepted. That is, at absolute worst, a curiosity. It does not require waking the sector commander at 0300. And if it's not at absolute worst..." Thatcher looked at her for a long moment. "Then I want to be very, very sure before I say so out loud," he said. "Give me a second confirmation. You have 90 minutes before the loop resets. Use them." They used 83 of them. Voss, Lieutenant Aram Voss, the station's other signal specialist, a broad, unhurried man who approached every problem like it owed him money, ran the phase analysis through a completely different tool chain and got the same slope, the same direction, the same conclusion, 20 minutes faster than May had, which he announced with the quiet satisfaction of a man who just won an argument nobody else knew they were having. "Confirmed," he said. "Source migrated. Whatever's transmitting now isn't on the moon. I cross-referenced orbital catalogs. There's a structure at these coordinates." He threw up a star map, a system schematic, a small mark point in the cold dark beyond Threll's Grave's outermost moon, designated K9-7 in our own survey data, logged as debris. Nobody's looked at it since the war ended because nobody had a reason to. "Define debris," Thatcher said. 40 meters across. Irregular mass. Read as inert wreckage during the war. Low albedo. No power signature. No thermal bloom. Standard profile for a dead hulk. Voss tapped the screen, and a thermal overlay bloomed across the object. Faint but unmistakable. Except it's not cold anymore. Something in there has been drawing power for at least the last 6 months, based on the decay curve. Maybe longer. "Could be anything," Thatcher said, but it wasn't a denial. It was a man hoping out loud. "Automated systems, reactor leak, residual." "Sir," May's voice came out steadier than she felt. "I pulled the original survey logs from the week before the armistice. K9-7 was cataloged as debris because it matched the profile of debris. But the size, the mass, the silhouette." She brought up an old reconnaissance image, grainy, taken in passing by a ship with better things to worry about. "It's not debris. It's a Scarn lifeboat. A big one. Population class." The room went very still. "How big is population class?" Thatcher said. "For the Scarn? Anywhere from a few hundred individuals to a few thousand. They don't travel like we do. No separate crew quarters. No life support in our sense. A Scarn lifeboat is basically a chunk of their home lattice, cut loose, kept dark and cold and waiting." May's mouth was dry. If it's been drawing power for 6 months, that means something on board switched it on. 6 months ago. And it's been broadcasting our surrender message, on loop, at a fraction of a degree of phase drift we wouldn't have caught if I hadn't happened to be bored at 3 in the morning, for at least that long. "Why would they broadcast our surrender?" Voss said. "It's not their message." "I don't think it's a message at all," May said. "I think it's the only signal they had a copy of. I think they found our old surrender broadcast still sitting in some relay's memory, and they're using it the only way that makes sense to them, as a carrier wave. A "we are here" signal, riding on the one frequency they knew humans were still listening to. Thatcher closed his eyes for a second. When he opened them, the careful calm was still there, but underneath it, for the first time, May saw something that looked almost like dread. "You're telling me," he said, "that for 6 months, possibly longer, there have been scarn survivors 40 meters from our listening post, broadcasting for help on the only channel they thought we'd recognize, and our automated systems filed it under corrupted recording, no action required, and went back to sleep?" Nobody answered, because there was nothing to say that wouldn't make it worse. "Give me sector command," Thatcher said quietly, "and give me everything we have on Scarn lifeboat life support tolerances. I want to know how long 6 months in the dark gives them before this becomes a recovery operation instead of a rescue." The number, when Voss found it, was bad. Scarn lifeboats run minimal cycling, slow metabolism, low power, the works. Best case, with everything optimized, a population-class boat can stretch consumables for maybe 5 years. Best case. Voss didn't look up from the screen. But that's assuming the boat launched intact, with full reserves, under controlled conditions. This one didn't. It's wreckage from a destroyed moon installation. However it ended up out here, it wasn't part of anyone's evacuation plan. "So what's our window?" Thatcher asked. "I'm working on it. The power draw I'm reading is climbing, slowly, but climbing. That usually means a system under increasing strain, not one settling into a stable rhythm." Voss finally turned around. "If I had to bet, and I hate this bet, I'd say whatever's keeping that boat survivable is failing. Could be days. Could be hours. The broadcast itself might be the last thing they had the power to spare." "I don't think it's a message at all," May said. "I think it's the only signal they had a copy of. I think they found our old surrender broadcast still sitting in some relay's memory, and they're using it the only way that makes sense to them, as a carrier wave. A 'we are here' signal, riding on the one frequency they knew humans were still listening to." Thatcher closed his eyes for a second. When he opened them, the careful calm was still there, but underneath it, for the first time, May saw something that looked almost like dread. "You're telling me," he said, "that for 6 months, possibly longer, there have been scarn survivors 40 meters from our listening post, broadcasting for help on the only channel they thought we'd recognize, and our automated systems filed it under corrupted recording, no action required, and went back to sleep?" Nobody answered, because there was nothing to say that wouldn't make it worse. "Give me sector command," Thatcher said quietly, "and give me everything we have on Scarn lifeboat life support tolerances. I want to know how long 6 months in the dark gives them before this becomes a recovery operation instead of a rescue." The number, when Voss found it, was bad. Scarn lifeboats run minimal cycling, slow metabolism, low power, the works. Best case, with everything optimized, a population-class boat can stretch consumables for maybe 5 years. Best case. Voss didn't look up from the screen. But that's assuming the boat launched intact, with full reserves, under controlled conditions. This one didn't. It's wreckage from a destroyed moon installation. However it ended up out here, it wasn't part of anyone's evacuation plan. "So what's our window?" Thatcher asked. "I'm working on it. The power draw I'm reading is climbing, slowly, but climbing. That usually means a system under increasing strain, not one settling into a stable rhythm." Voss finally turned around. "If I had to bet, and I hate this bet, I'd say whatever's keeping that boat survivable is failing. Could be days. Could be hours. The broadcast itself might be the last thing they had the power to spare." May felt something cold settle into her chest. "Then every minute we spend confirming this is a minute we're not." "I know, Doctor." Thatcher was already moving, already pulling up the comm array, already issuing the string of priority codes that would wake half the sector. "Cephew, get me a tight beam channel to that boat. Every Scarn protocol we still have on file, full power. If there's anyone awake over there, I want them to know we're coming before we get close enough to look like a threat." "On it." Cephew's hands were already flying across his console, and for once there was no joke in his voice at all. "Voss, I want a recovery shuttle prepped and crewed in 20 minutes. Volunteers only, but I want it to not need volunteers, because everyone on this station is going to want to be on it. and I need most of you here running the relay. Understood. Voss was already moving too. Akonquolin. Thatcher turned to her, and for just a moment the calm cracked enough that she could see the man underneath it. Someone doing math he didn't want to be doing, weighing things that shouldn't have weights at all. You found this. You're the only one on this station who spent 4 years getting fluent in how the Skarn structure information. If there's anyone alive over there, and they're trying to say something with that broadcast beyond just we exist, I need you to be able to hear it. Can you do that? May thought about the static burst, the phase drift, the patience of a signal that had been calling out for 6 months in a language built from the only words it had. Yes, sir, she said. I can hear it. The shuttle was a cramped thing, built for cargo and pressed into service for people, and it crossed the gap between Kestrel 9 and the dark mass of K9-7 in 11 minutes that felt like 11 hours. May sat strapped into a jump seat with a headset feeding her live telemetry from the boat's broadcast, watching the phase drift continue its slow, patient crawl, and tried not to think about the word recovery and what it might end up meaning. Coming up on visual, the pilot said, lighting it up now. The flood swept across 40 meters of scarred, irregular hull. Not metal, not quite, but something with the dull crystalline sheen May had seen in a dozen Skarn structures, a material that looked grown rather than built. Most of it was dark, pitted, clearly damaged, but one section small, no bigger than the shuttle itself, glowed faintly from within, a deep amber light pulsing in a rhythm that made the hair on May's arm stand up because she recognized it. It was the same rhythm as the static burst, the same rhythm and light. They're still transmitting, she said. Right now. Actively. Copy. Matching velocity. Prepping for docking. The pilot's voice was tight. Doctor, any idea what we're going to find in there? May looked at the pulsing amber light, slow and steady and impossibly stubborn, for years and 6 months, and who knew how many close calls, into a weight that should have killed whoever was inside a dozen times over. Survivors, she said. I think we're going to find survivors. She was wrong about that. Not about the survivors, about the rest of it, about all of it. But she wouldn't understand how wrong for another 6 hours, and by then it would already be too late to do anything but live with it. The docking took longer than anyone wanted, because the boat's hull wasn't built for human docking collars, and the recovery team had to cut their way in through a section that Vossascan suggested was the closest thing the structure had to an airlock. May watched it on the shuttle's external feed, helpless, useless, a translator with nothing yet to translate, while 4 crew in vac suits worked a cutting torch against material that sparked amber and gold instead of the usual dull orange of metal. We're through, came the call, 11 minutes later, and then a long pause, and then, oh, report, Thatcher's voice, patched through from Kestrel 9, tight with 4 hours of waiting. Sir, it's... The voice belonged to one of the recovery team, a young tech named Park, and it cracked halfway through the sentence. It's mostly empty. The lattice, what the Skarn use instead of, I don't know, bodies in storage, whatever, it's mostly dark. Inert. There's maybe a dozen active nodes out of what should be hundreds. A dozen survivors, May said. That's Park. That's still a dozen people. Are they responsive? Can you? Doctor, that's not. Park stopped. Started again. The active nodes aren't where the people would be. They're concentrated around a single structure near what I guess is the boat's core. It looks like everything that still has power got routed there. Deliberately. Recently. May's stomach dropped. Show me, she said. The feed that came through a moment later was grainy, lit only by the amber pulse and the harsh white of suit lights, and it took May a long moment to understand what she was looking at, because nothing in 4 years of Skarn linguistic study had prepared her for it. It was a transmitter, a crude one, built, not grown, built, with hands or whatever the Skarn equivalent was, out of components scavenged from a dozen dead systems around it, wired together in a tangle that should not have worked and clearly did, because it was still pulsing, still broadcasting, still patiently repeating a message in a language that wasn't its own, because it was the only language anyone had left to borrow, and wired into the center of it, not powering it, part of it. Lattice structure fused directly into the transmitter's core in a way that made May's throat close up, was a single scar node, still glowing, still impossibly active. They didn't keep the boat alive to save themselves, May said, very quietly, understanding arriving all at once, all wrong, all too late. They used everything, every system, every reserve, every person, to keep this transmitter running. They've been feeding at the lattice itself, one node at a time, for months. Why? Thatcher said, and his voice had gone very far away. Because they didn't think anyone was going to come for them, May said. I don't think this was ever a rescue beacon. I think. She stared at the pulsing amber light, the patient rhythm, the 6 months of slow phase drift she'd nearly missed. I think this is a warning. Talk to me, Doctor. Thatcher's voice, an hour later, back on Kestrel 9. Every screen in the small ops center filled with data May had spent that hour trying to make sense of. What kind of warning? I don't know yet. But the broadcast pattern, it's not random. And it's not just our old surrender message anymore. There's a secondary modulation underneath it. Something I missed before because it's tiny, microsecond scale, riding on top of the carrier. Skarn don't communicate in words the way we do. They communicate in structure, in relationships between signals. This is structure. May pulled the modulation up, isolated, magnified 1,000 times. It's a star map. The room went quiet. A star map of where? Voss asked. Of here. This system, and the systems around it. I recognize the configuration. It matches our own charts. May traced a line across the projection, a chain of marked points radiating outward from Threll's grave. But there's an overlay, a second pattern, superimposed on the map, moving. And it's not Skarn in origin. The structural grammar is completely different, harsher, more. She struggled for the word. Linear. Aggressive. I've never seen anything like it in 4 years of Skarn signal data. Could it be ours? Some artifact of the original broadcast we're misreading? No. May zoomed further, and felt the cold in her chest spread until it reached her hands. Voss, run this against the deep catalog. Everything we have on file. I think. She didn't want to say it. Saying it would make it real. I think this is a third signal type. Not human. Not Skarn. Something else. Voss ran it. It took 90 seconds, and in those 90 seconds, May watched the overlay pattern again, the harsh linear movement crawling slowly across the star map, and noticed, too late to stop the dread that was already crystallizing into certainty, that the movement had a direction. It was moving toward the mark point that, on their own charts, corresponded to Threll's grave. To here. Match found. Voss said, and his voice had gone flat in the way voices go when the speaker is trying very hard not to react. Partial match. Sector Command flagged this signature 18 months ago. Outerbound listening posts. 3 separate incidents. All classified. All marked, unidentified, non-hostile, low priority. He looked up. It's not in any combat database. It's in the survey database. Filed under. He read it like it tasted bad. Apex migratory pattern. Origin unknown. Designation veil. Migratory. Thatcher repeated. Sir, the Skarn surrendered to us 4 years ago, May said, and now that she'd started, the pieces were falling into place faster than she could say them, faster than she wanted them to. We always assumed it was because we won. Strategic collapse, superior firepower, all the reasons in every after-action report. But the timeline never quite worked. We were winning, yes, but we weren't close to a knockout blow. The Skarn High Command surrendered an entire front, gave up territory they could have defended for years, with almost no negotiation. It never made sense from a purely military standpoint. You're saying it wasn't about us, Thatcher said slowly. I'm saying, May said, that 4 years ago, something started moving through Skarn space, something the Skarn had encountered before, something old enough and bad enough that an entire species decided the smartest thing they could do, the only thing they could do, was retreat as fast as possible and put a buffer between themselves and it. She looked at the star map, at the harsh crawling pattern, at the dozen Skarn who had spent the last 6 months of their lives feeding their own bodies into a transmitter to send a message nobody was meant to receive yet, and the buffer they picked was us. The silence that followed lasted long enough that May could hear her own pulse. We didn't win the war, she said. We were positioned. The Skarn retreated past us because they knew whatever was coming would hit us first, and they needed the time that would buy them. The surrender wasn't a collapse. It was a trade. And the people on that lifeboat, Thatcher said, very quietly, knew that, and stayed behind anyway, to warn us. To warn somebody, May said. I don't think they cared who. I don't think they had the power left to care. She looked at the slow crawl of the overlay pattern, the thing called veil, migratory, apex, moving steadily toward a point on the star map that every chart in human space called home territory and every chart in Skarn space, apparently, called next. How long? Thatcher said. Until it gets here. Voss was already running the numbers, cross-referencing the pattern's drift rate against the same kind of phase analysis May had used 6 hours ago. And when he looked up, his face had the particular blankness of a man delivering news. He couldn't quite process himself. Based on the modulation rate and the distances on their map, he said, and assuming their sense of soon translates anything like ours. Voss, 71 hours, sir. Give or take. 71 hours. May sat with that number for a long time after the room cleared, after Thatcher had gone to draft the message that would wake up every command post in the sector, after Voss had gone to keep running analyses that wouldn't change the answer no matter how many times he ran them. 71 hours until something that had made an entire spacefaring civilization choose extinction by proxy over confrontation arrived at a system that, as of 6 hours ago, humanity had considered a quiet, mostly empty backwater. A system with one relay station, 40 people, and 3 jumps away, a colony of 40,000, Meridian Reach. Hey, Cephu's voice quiet from the doorway. He'd brought 2 mugs again. Real coffee this time. The good stuff. The kind they save for emergencies, which told May everything she needed to know about how everyone else was reading the situation. He sat down across from her and didn't say anything for a while. Just let her stare at the star map until the lines stopped meaning anything. You did good work today, he said eventually. I found a warning nobody can do anything within time, May said. 71 hours isn't enough to evacuate a colony, Cephu. It's barely enough to evacuate us. It's enough to try. Try and fail is still fail. Yeah, Cephu turned his mug in his hands. But here's the thing about today, May. 12 people on that boat had no hours. They had nothing. No fleet, no warning system, no 40-person station to call. They had a dying transmitter and a message they didn't think anyone would ever hear, and they spent everything they had sending it anyway. He looked up at her. 71 hours is more than they had. It's not enough, but it's something, and something's the only thing anybody's ever had to work with, when you get right down to it. May didn't answer, but she drank the coffee. And after a while the star map stopped looking like a countdown and started looking, again, like a problem, which was, she realized, exactly what Cephu had been trying to do. It was a small thing. It didn't fix anything. It was enough to let her stand up and go back to work. The next 18 hours were the kind of controlled chaos that May had only ever read about in after-action reports, and living through it, she understood for the first time why those reports always felt flattened, sanitized, like they were describing a different event than the one that had actually happened. Sector Command's response arrived 4 hours after Thatcher's message went out, and it arrived in 2 parts that contradicted each other before either had finished transmitting. The first part was an evacuation order for Meridian Reach, partial, prioritized, the kind of triage list that turned 40,000 people into categories on a spreadsheet. Essential personnel, families with children under 5, the medically vulnerable. 3 transport ships were being redirected. They could lift, at absolute maximum capacity, 11,000 people. The second part, arriving 90 seconds later from a different channel, was a fleet deployment order. Every available warship in 2 adjacent sectors, redirected to rendezvous at Threll's grave, to intercept and assess the Veil migratory body and determine appropriate response, which May translated privately as, somebody in command thinks we can fight this. They can't both be right, Voss said, reading both orders over May's shoulder. If we think we can hold the line here, why evacuate Meridian Reach? And if we're evacuating Meridian Reach, why send a fleet toward the thing instead of screening the retreat? Because nobody actually knows what the Veil are, May said. Commands hedging. Evacuate in case we lose. Mass force in case we can win. And hope the 71-hour window means we find out which before we have to commit to either. That's not a strategy. That's two strategies wearing a trench coat. Welcome to every decision made under uncertainty in the history of... May stopped. What? The lifeboat. She was already pulling up the recovery team's full survey data. The one Parks team had gathered before the last node on board had gone dark, 6 hours ago, mercifully without pain, according to the medical officer who'd been monitoring it. Though May suspected that was kindness more than certainty. When the recovery team cut their way in, they cataloged everything. Every component in that improvised transmitter. I want to know where it came from. Where it came from. It's Scarn salvage, obviously. Not all of it. May found what she was looking for. An inventory, painstaking. Parks' team had clearly been thorough even in grief. There's a component in the transmitter's power regulation stage that doesn't match any Scarn manufacturing signature in our database. It's not Scarn, and it's not human either. Veil. Voss's voice had gone careful. I think so. I think it's salvage from a Veil vessel, which means at some point, the Scarn encountered a Veil ship up close enough to take pieces of it. May felt the shape of something starting to form, distant, uncertain, but real. Voss, if the Scarn fought the Veil, even once, even briefly, even and lost, they'd have data, tactical data, sensor profiles, weapon signatures, something. A species that chooses extinction by proxy over confrontation doesn't make that choice lightly, and they don't make it blind. They'd have run the numbers first. And the numbers would be somewhere in Scarn records. Records that, 4 years ago, we captured a lot of during the war, and have been sitting on ever since because nobody had a reason to translate 8 petabytes of military archive from a species we'd already beaten. May was already pulling up the access requests, the translation queue, the long list of Scarn data nobody had ever prioritized because the war was over and there'd been no urgency. Sephew, how fast can you get me access to the captured archive from Threll's Grave's primary command node, the one we took in the last week of the war? Theoretically, immediately, it's all stored on the relay secondary array. We've had it the whole time. Sephew was already moving to his console. Practically, May, it's 8 petabytes. Untranslated. We have, 67 hours left. Then I need help, May said. Everyone on this station who's ever taken a Scarn linguistics module, I need them in the analysis bay in 10 minutes. We're not translating 8 petabytes. We're looking for one thing. Anything in there that tells us what the Scarn knew about the Veil, and why they were scared enough to bet an entire species on the hope that we'd survive long enough to figure it out ourselves. They found it 11 hours later, with 56 hours left on the clock, and it was Voss, stubborn, methodical Voss, who'd spent 11 straight hours running pattern-matching searches against sensor logs while everyone else chased linguistic threads. Who found it? I wasn't looking for a document, he explained, voice rough with exhaustion, eyes red-rimmed but bright. I was looking for a gap. Scarn sensor logs from the Western Front are continuous, near total, for the entire war, except for one 11-day stretch, 6 weeks before the surrender, where an entire sensor network just stops. No combat record, no damage report, just a clean break. And then it picks back up with every Scarn ship in the sector running what their tactical doctrine calls maximum dispersal. Basically, scatter and don't regroup, ever, for any reason. What happened in those 11 days? I don't know exactly, but I found fragments, sensor data that got swept up automatically by passive recorders before whatever happened. And one of those fragments is a tracking solution, a single Veil vessel, picked up by Scarn long-range sensors, tracked for about 4 minutes before the recorder cuts out. He pulled it up. May, it's one ship. A scout, probably, based on the size estimate. One ship, and the Scarn tracking data shows it doing something their own combat AI flagged, in its final logged annotation as. He read the translation carefully, like he didn't quite trust it. Non-responsive to all engagement. Not undamaged. Not shielded. Non-responsive, like the weapon's fire wasn't registering as having happened at all. They shot it and it didn't notice, May said slowly. They shot it with everything, based on the power expenditure in the log, and 4 minutes later the recorder cuts out, not destroyed, just stops, like someone reached over and turned it off. And the next thing in the timeline is the entire sector's sensor network going dark for 11 days. Voss looked up, and for the first time since May had met him, he looked genuinely frightened. Whatever happened in those 11 days, the Skarn never recorded it, or couldn't, and when their systems came back online, every surviving ship in the sector had standing orders to never, under any circumstances, attempt to engage a Veil vessel again, even in self-defense, especially in self-defense. The analysis bay was silent except for the hum of overworked cooling systems. That's not a tactical assessment, Thatcher said, from the doorway. He'd been there a while, May realized, listening. That's a species learning, in 11 days, that fighting back was the thing that made it worse. Sir, with respect, we don't know that. We have a sensor gap, and a scared species is standing orders. That's not evidence of anything except... Doctor. Thatcher's voice was very gentle and very tired. I've read 1,000 after-action reports in my career. I have never, not once, seen a standing order phrased as an absolute. Never, under any circumstances. Militaries don't write that. They write avoid where possible. Minimize engagement. They leave themselves an out, because commanders always want an out. He looked at the screen, at the 4 minutes of tracking data, at the 11-day gap that followed it like a held breath. The only time you write an absolute is when you've already tried the alternative, and it cost you everything. Nobody spoke. 56 hours, Thatcher said quietly. I need to get this to the fleet commander before they're in range, because right now, the plan is to mass every available warship and assess. And if what we're looking at is a species that learned, the hard way, that engagement itself, any engagement, any weapons fire, any visible response at all, is the trigger for something far worse than the thing that triggers it. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Then the fleet can't fight it, May said. The fleet, Thatcher said, might be the worst possible thing we could send. The next message took 6 hours to compose, because every word of it had to be right, and every word of it was going to be ignored by at least some of the people who received it, because, as Thatcher said, with the particular bitterness of a man who'd spent 30 years inside institutions he respected and distrusted in roughly equal measure, you cannot tell a fleet commander 48 hours out from a potential engagement that the correct tactical response is to do nothing, and expect that to be the end of the conversation. It wasn't the end of the conversation. It was, in fact, the beginning of several conversations, conducted across 48 hours, at increasing volume, between people who were not in the same room and would not be for the duration of the crisis, and May, who had never in her life wanted less to be the person whose name was on a report, found herself, again and again, being asked to defend a conclusion built on 11 days of silence and 4 minutes of sensor static. "You're asking me," said a voice on the comm that belonged to someone several ranks above anyone May had ever spoken to directly, 29 hours before estimated arrival, to stand down a fleet of 41 warships, in the face of an approaching unknown, on the basis of a translation of an annotation. "Yes, sir," May said. Her voice didn't shake. She was almost surprised by that. "And if you're wrong? If this veil is simply a powerful but conventional threat, and we sit there with our hands folded while it advances on a system with 40,000 civilians, then we'll have lost the system anyway, sir, because 41 warships didn't stop the Skarn's entire Western fleet from running the moment they saw what one scout ship could survive." May made herself keep going, even though every instinct screamed at her to soften it. "Sir, I'm not asking you to do nothing. I'm asking you to do something the Skarn never tried, because they never had the chance to. Not respond. Don't shoot. Don't shield up in a way that reads as a weapons lock. Don't move to intercept. Hold position. Broadcast on every frequency we have something that says, as close as we can manage, we see you and we are not a threat. And get every civilian off Meridian reach in the meantime, because if I'm wrong about the rest of it, that's the part that actually saves lives no matter what." There was a long pause. "That's not a strategy, Doctor. That's a prayer." "Sir," Thatcher said, He'd been quiet through most of this, letting May carry it. But now his voice came through, steady and certain in a way that, for the first time in 2 days, made the room feel like it had solid ground under it again. With respect, it's both. And given the alternative is a strategy we have direct evidence failed catastrophically in 11 days, against a species with a 1,000-year head start on us in dealing with the veil, I'd rather try the prayer. The pause this time was longer. The evacuation order stands, full priority. All available transports, the voice said finally. Fleet will hold position at the system's edge. Hold, Colonel, not advance, not engage. Passive sensors only. And God help all of us if you're wrong, because there will be nothing left to court-martial anyone over. The channel cut. Thatcher exhaled, long and slow, and for a moment looked 20 years older than he had 2 days ago. 29 hours, he said. Get some sleep, Doctor. That's an order. You can't translate anything else with your eyes closed, and we're going to need you again before this is over. She didn't sleep. Nobody did much in the hours that followed. The station's small crew quarters became a place people passed through rather than stayed in, everyone drifting between the analysis bay and the observation deck, watching the slow crawl of telemetry that, this close, no longer needed translation, because what it showed was simple enough for anyone to read. Something was coming. It was big, bigger than anything in the original migratory pattern data had suggested. A presence that lit up every passive sensor on the station despite making no attempt to broadcast anything at all. And it was quiet, in a way that May found, against all reason, more unsettling than any weapon's signature would have been. No comms chatter, no active scanning, no maneuvering, just a slow, massive, patient approach, the way a tide comes in, not because it's trying to reach you, but because that's simply the shape of what it does. 12 hours out, the evacuation of Meridian Reach reached its grim ceiling. 11,407 people lifted clear. Every transport at capacity. Every shuttle that could fly pressed into service for one final run each before fuel reserves forced to stop. 28,000 people remained on the surface because there was nowhere left to put them and no more time to find anywhere. May watched the final transport reports come through and thought about a dozen scarn, feeding themselves into a transmitter one at a time, for a message they didn't think anyone would hear. It's not enough, she said, to no one in particular. 11,000 out of 40. It's not enough. No, Sephew agreed, beside her, the way he had been for most of the last 2 days. But 28,000 people are alive right now who, 3 days ago, didn't know there was anything to be afraid of, and now have a chance, not a guarantee, a chance, because somebody listened to a signal at 3 in the morning instead of going back to bed. And if I'm wrong about the rest of it, then it was still the right call to make with what you had. Sephew's voice was quiet, steady, the voice of a man who had run out of jokes 2 days ago and hadn't reached for one since. May, look at me. You didn't choose for this thing to be 71 hours away. You didn't choose for there only to be 3 transport ships. You found a problem nobody else could even see. And then you found the only thing anyone's ever had, a chance, and you fought for it. That's not nothing. That's not enough, maybe. But it's not nothing. 2 hours out. The fleet reported visual confirmation. The vessel, singular. The survey data had been right about that much at least. Larger than any human or scarn ship on record. Surface like dark glass. Moving at a velocity that suggested no deceleration plan at all. On a course that would carry it directly through the system. Directly past Meridian Reach. Directly past Kestrel 9 and onward into human space beyond. Unless something changed. All ships passive only, came the fleet commander's voice, tight and controlled, across the open channel that every station in the system was monitoring. Hold position. Repeat. Hold position. Nobody so much as charges a capacitor. The minutes that followed were the longest of May's life. She watched the dark shape on the long-range feed grow, slowly, inexorably, past the fleet's position, past the edge of the system, a presence that dwarfed everything around it and seemed, from the sensor data, entirely indifferent to all of it, no course correction, no acknowledgement, nothing. And then, 40 minutes from Meridian Reach, with 28,000 people on the surface, holding whatever breath they had left to hold, the dark shape's course shifted, Not toward the colony. Away from it. A slow, vast, almost lazy correction, bending its path outward, around the system, skirting the edge of the gravity, well, like something stepping carefully around a puddle it hadn't quite noticed before and, having noticed, simply chose not to step in. "It's altering course," came the report, and May heard, in the speaker's voice, the precise moment that 2 days of held breath finally broke. "Repeat. The Veil vessel is altering course, moving away from the system." It's a pause, disbelief audible even across the static. "It's going around us." It took another 9 hours for the dark shape to clear the system entirely, still moving, still patient, still utterly silent, vanishing back into the deep dark on a heading that the fleet's astrogators traced, with growing unease, toward a cluster of systems on the far side of human space, a direction nobody had ever bothered mapping in detail, because nobody had ever had a reason to. 9 hours, during which nobody on Kestrel, 9 spoke much above a whisper, as if the thing that had passed them by might still hear. It was Voss, eventually, staring at the cleared sensor feed with the particular blankness of someone whose body hadn't caught up with the fact that the emergency was over, who said the thing that had been sitting unspoken at the center of everything since the moment the dark shape changed course. "It wasn't avoiding a fight," he said slowly. 41 warships, passive sensors or not. That's not nothing. If it was scared of us, it would have kept its distance from the start, or it would have come in fast and hard to clear the obstacle before we could organize. It did neither. It came in slow, on a straight course, like it hadn't even registered we were here. And then, 40 minutes out, it noticed something, and it adjusted, and the adjustment was just a correction, like stepping around a chair you almost walked into. "You're saying it never saw us as a threat at all," May said. "I'm saying," Voss said, "I don't think it saw us as anything. Not until the very end. And then it saw, I don't know what, something, and it decided, in less time than it takes to say it, that going around was easier than going through." He looked at May, and there was something almost like awe in his exhaustion. "Doctor, what if the thing it saw, 40 minutes out, wasn't us at all? What if it was the broadcast, the Skarn transmitter, still on Kestrel 9's relay, still looping, our old surrender message, with a star map and a warning baked into the static, that's been sitting on an open channel for 4 years, getting louder the closer anything gets, because of the phase drift?" May felt something settle into place, slow and strange and enormous. "The Skarn didn't just warn us," she said. "They left a sign. On the door. In a language they were gambling the Veil might recognize, because the Veil had encountered the Skarn before, in those 11 days, and whatever happened, something about that encounter ended with the Skarn's tracking data, and the Veil's own salvage ending up fused into the same transmitter." She looked at the star map, the slow patient pulse, the message that had been broadcasting for 6 months, and had, perhaps, just saved 28,000 lives in its final hours of existence. "We didn't survive because we were strong enough to be left alone. We survived because 12 people who were already dying spent everything they had left building something that said, in a language only one species in this entire encounter could read, 'We already tried this. Don't.' And it listened," Cepheus said quietly, "or it recognized the marker, and chose the path of least resistance, the same way it's probably done 1,000 times before, across however many systems it's already passed through on its way to wherever it's actually going." May looked at the empty space where the dark shape had been, already gone, already forgotten by whatever vast, patient, unknowable process drove it. "We don't know which. We'll probably never know which. But either way," she thought of 12 glowing nodes, going dark one at a time, feeding a signal nobody asked them to send. "Either way, it wasn't us. It was never us. The war wasn't ours to win, and this wasn't ours to survive. We were just lucky enough to be standing where someone else's last act of kindness happened to reach." 3 weeks later, the 11,407 evacuees from Meridian Reach began returning home, carefully, in stages, with every sensor in the sector watching the sky behind them for a shape that never came back. Sector Command quietly reclassified the Veil from apex migratory pattern, origin unknown, to non-engagement priority. All contact protocols suspended pending further study. A designation that Voss said, with the first real laugh May had heard from him in weeks, was the longest sentence ever written for the phrase, "Please, everybody, just leave it alone." And on Kestrel 9, in the analysis bay, May sat with the recovered lifeboat's final inventory open on her screen. The dozen names the Scarn database had, with effort, been able to attach to the dark lattice nodes, names that meant nothing to most of humanity, and would mean nothing for a long time yet, because there was no ceremony in either species' tradition for this, for a debt owed across a war that both sides had, it turned out, already lost to something else entirely that ASO she did the only thing she could think of. She took the 12 names, and the star map, and the 4 minutes of tracking data, and the 11 days of silence, and the slow, patient pulse of a transmitter that had kept broadcasting until the very last node went dark, and she filed it, not as an after-action report, not as a classified annex, but as the first entry in something new, a record meant to be read, someday, by whoever came next, human or Scarn, or something neither of them had met yet. She called it, because she couldn't think of anything better, the Kestrel Ledger. Page 1 was a star map, with a warning on it. Page 2 was 12 names. Page 3, she left blank, just in case someone, someday, needed somewhere to put their own. Sephew found her there an hour later, 2 mugs of the good coffee in hand, and read over her shoulder, without comment for a while. "You know," he said eventually, "for someone who spent her whole life listening for patterns nobody else can hear, you're pretty bad at noticing when it's time to stop working and go to bed." "I'll stop," May said, "when I figure out what to write on page 3. You don't have to figure that out tonight." "I know." She looked at the blank page a moment longer, then closed the file, and took the coffee. "But somebody's going to need it eventually. Better that it's there, waiting, than that we find out too late it should have been." Sephew smiled, and didn't argue, and outside the viewport, Threll's grave turned slowly in the dark, quiet, for the first time in 4 years, in a way that felt almost like peace.